Welcome back everyone to episode 32. Today's topic is in fact podcasting and how brands can use podcasts to acquire customers, engage existing ones, or even just for internal use. I've got Roger Nairn here with me today. Roger is the co-founder and CEO of Jar Audio, who work with brands to build out ROI-driven podcasts. There's loads of opportunities out there for brands to run fun and engaging podcasts that their audiences will love, and Roger is here to explain how you too can launch a podcast for your business. Hi, Roger. Thank you so much for joining me today. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, a bit of your background, and why you do what you do at the moment?
Absolutely. So my name is Roger Nairn. I'm the CEO of Jar Audio. Jar Audio is a production agency that works exclusively in podcasts and exclusively with brands. So I came from the advertising world. Spent almost 20 years working in client service, producing campaigns for Netflix and Four Seasons and Nordstrom and Walmart, big brands that told great stories. And I had always loved the podcast world. And when I, wanted to start my own business, I thought to myself, how could I blend my advertising career and my client service expertise with podcasting? And so, teamed up with a couple of great partners, one of which comes from the journalism world, one of which comes from the technical broadcast world, and we created an agency that specifically produces podcasts for brands.
All right, that sounds great. How long have you been doing that?
So we started as a partnership 3 years ago, and we were literally building the business off the side of our desks. I was still working in advertising. Jen, my partner, was a producer in the radio world and also teaches podcasting at the University of British Columbia. And then my other partner, Aaron, was also in broadcasting at the time and also was doing some freelance work. And so we started as a partnership for a couple of years, but then we incorporated. It'll be 1 year next week, actually. We've been in sort of full-time go mode since then.
Yeah, pretty much as podcasts are just exploding, really. I mean, I know they've been a thing for a couple of years now, but it feels, and I know we're in October already, I feel like this year's disappeared. But all right, so probably the last 2 years is when I feel like podcasts really, really got going.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's still relatively, small compared to other forms of media. But on a daily basis, it's overtaking the likes of radio and even TV. So it's chipping away at that, that larger media market, literally day by day. And I mean, when the pandemic hit, we saw a dip. We saw a dip in listening. It's quite interesting, actually. The majority of the listening dip was due to the fact that people were no longer commuting.
Yeah.
Podcasting is traditionally a very, mobile medium. And when people stopped taking the tube or taking the bus or driving to work, listening did take a dip. But then we saw a rise back to normal literally within about a month and a half to 2 months, as people started to get a little bit more comfortable with their working from home situation. We saw a big bump in desktop listening. So people were listening on their laptop, or they were taking a bit of a break, from the day and chilling out on the couch. And so listening as a whole has pretty much risen back to normal and has actually exceeded what we were anticipating for the year, which is super exciting. Yeah,
definitely. So yeah, it kind of got back to normal, and now it's just back into that growth that you were probably seeing beforehand.
And I think that's just that's testament to how strong of an opportunity and this industry is.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, thinking about it, I pretty much never listen to anything at home. I always prefer, I've either got the TV on or I'm reading or something else. But I think it's because I kind of like to be concentrating on something else, but listening to a podcast.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Even if that is commuting.
Yeah, which is interesting because first of all, podcasting is such an intimate medium. You're literally, it's just you and the voice. We always talk about how a podcast is like somebody whispering into your ear. It's just this direct conversation to the listener. Rarely do people listen to a podcast in a group environment or with their spouse, unless they're driving in their car. That's actually one place where we see that. But because it is such an intimate medium, people are able to enjoy it while doing other things. And actually the fascinating thing from a marketing perspective, and this was a study done by the BBC. BBC did a study called Audio Activated. Suggest people should check it out online. The study said that 94% of listeners consume podcasts while performing other tasks, and the actual multitasking mode of listening actually elevates engagement with the brand, which pretty much flies in the face of everything we know about marketing. Everything we know about marketing is that too much clutter equals distraction equals lost messaging. But in fact, when you listen to a podcast while doing other things, the brain stays occupied, which means that the podcast content is taken in through what's called a low involvement processing. So it's a less, it's a much more fuel efficient process that has a lower cognitive load. So essentially multitasking, doing the dishes, mowing the lawn, running on the treadmill at the gym, that actually improves the brand message cut through, which is why we get so excited, or one of the many reasons why we get so excited about introducing podcasting to brands.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like the examples you've given are great examples. They're tasks which don't really require your attention. You can mow the lawn, get on a treadmill or a bike or something, and you kind of just, you don't need to be concentrating on moving your feet, really. I mean, exactly. All right, you do a little bit.
Yeah, you should. But if you're me, you do a little bit.
To a certain degree. But yeah, generally, you know what you're doing. You can just be running, and then you're just focusing on the podcast. I listen to one while I cook a bit, because I find,
absolutely,
even though I'm using a sharp knife, I need to be a bit more careful. It's not that bad. But yeah, what I couldn't do, and I've got a friend who listens to the Joe Rogan podcast while he works, and he's a developer as well. And I find it really strange that he'd be able to code and listen to a podcast, a really interesting podcast as well.
Totally.
I can't do that. I wouldn't be able to really, I wouldn't be able to read and listen to a podcast.
Well, yeah, it's so interesting though, because everyone has their ways of being able to, it's similar to reading. Some people can do a Kindle, some people can't. Some people can read in a moving car. Some people can't. Just the different ways that we're consuming media as media is changing so much. I find fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. The one I do find really weird is people who have a physical book, and reading it while walking down the street.
Yeah, that's weird and also super rude, I find. Because it's like I can let people go by checking their phone, because they might be looking at a map or their calendar invite of trying to figure out what the address of something is. But clearly, when you're reading a book, you do not care who's in your way or what's going on.
Yeah. Cool. So let's talk a bit more about podcasts for brands then. How has the uptake of podcasts changed over the last couple of years? Like, what sort of brands are using them, and how do they use them?
Yeah. So I'd say when brands started getting involved in podcasting, it was very much kind of in a sort of test and learn environment. A lot of them were doing the podcast on their own. And there's nothing wrong with doing a podcast on your own. You yourself is a great example of someone who's producing a fantastic podcast on their own. But what we did see a lot of was brands taking advantage of the of the medium and really talking a lot about themselves, and who wants to listen to a 20 or 30 minute episode that's just going to be an audio ad for the brand. And so where we saw the opportunity was to come in with our expertise and be able to take the brand values and marry them up with the needs of the audience and produce great audio that's going to be as listenable as possible. And so, what we started doing was sitting down with brands and really diving deep into, the audience that they're looking to reach, understand who they are, what they care about, what matters to them, where their pain points are, what are some of the things that they need to be either taught, or how do they need to feel, or how do they, what do they need to learn? And then we were coming up with, great podcast content that meets those needs, and in doing that, implementing a lot of, really well-tested storytelling techniques, and applying some really great audio production qualities to the show itself. And so what we started doing was creating podcasts with brands. We started out with a local brand here in Vancouver. We're in Vancouver, Canada. Great brand here called Sage Natural Wellness, which is they're now North American wide, but they do sort of integrative health, or essential oils and all that sort of stuff. And created a great podcast for them called Well Now, which was a conversation about integrative health and how to sort of take charge of your own personal health. It's a really fantastic show that is all about, kind of that dividing line between traditional medicine and, sort of new medicine, looking at, investigating the ins and outs of those worlds, and then really giving the listener an opportunity to take some action themselves. And it just happens to be brought to you by Sage. Very little mention of the brand throughout the episode. No mention at all about their products, because God, who wants to, again, listen to that? But what we did was create this great podcast that, people want to subscribe to and come back to, and it just happens to be brought to you by the brand. So they get that really nice brand halo effect. And so what brands are finding is that podcasting is a great opportunity to reach a new audience. Podcasts, do have quite a unique audience, but also, have a really authentic, engaging conversation with that audience. And when I say engaging, when you look at the Jar Audio podcast, we get upwards of 98 to 100% listen through rates on our episodes. And that's for a 20 to 30 minute episode, which, in the marketing world is astounding levels of engagement. The average YouTube video, for example, average 1 minute YouTube video, for example, gets about a 50% engagement rate. So by creating great content, brands are able to capture the attention of the audience and hold them, essentially in their funnel for as long as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, like you say, 98% engagement rate is incredible. I mean, how long is the podcast? How long is an episode?
So it varies. It varies by client, and we don't really have a rule for how long an episode needs to be. But the sort of sweet spot we find is 20 minutes. But we've gone up to 30. We're just in production on a podcast right now that has 45-minute episodes. Our creative director, Jen Moss, likes to say that the episode needs to be as long as it needs to be. And so it can vary.
Yeah. But so to have people listening to your brand for, even if it's not mentioned too much, but to be engaging with your brand for 20 to 30 minutes in one go is fantastic. I mean, exactly. You don't really get that unless you write an absolutely epic blog post.
Totally.
You can't really get that engagement elsewhere.
And you yourself as a marketer know that, marketers these days rarely have a hard time getting, capturing the attention of an audience, with all the targeting that can be done and programmatic and all that sort of stuff. But holding that audience's attention for as long as possible, becomes the real big challenge. I keep saying clients, but customers are less forgiving of brands, less loyal of brands. They are less trusting of brands than ever before. And plus you've got this fragmented market of so many different, so much competition. And so, brands are constantly losing people out of the funnel and having to replenish them, which is expensive. The cost per acquisition of a customer is increasing drastically. It's in the US, it's overtaking inflation. And so we look at podcasts as a great opportunity to, put a plug in the funnel and capture an audience's attention and keep them in that funnel for as long as possible. And a lot of that is down to the great content. So if you produce great content, the beautiful thing about podcasting is that it's a subscribable medium. So, it's very much a pull medium. If we do our job right, customers are going to want more of it, and so they subscribe and they get served up more of it, when it's released. So in doing so, we have this great mechanism where just the behavior of listening to a podcast alone keeps them as engaged as possible. And then once we have them engaged, and listening to the show, if we can keep them listening to that episode as long as possible, it's incredibly beneficial to the brand.
Yeah, definitely. And like you say, it's the medium helps as well. If people have got a 30-minute task to do, like going for a run or cooking or something, it's just the perfect time to listen to a podcast. And unless the content is bad, there's not really a reason to switch it off.
Totally.
It's very easy to just leave your headphones in, or put your laptop or iPads off to the side, hit play, and kind of forget about it in that way. Just leave the device alone.
Exactly. And sorry, I should also add that with the rise of different streaming platforms, let's take Spotify as an example. You're no longer. It's not to say you're no longer, but you see less and less users downloading the actual file to their device, and instead they're streaming. And so what streaming allows you to do is to continue the podcast should you happen to be switching tasks. So, I get out of my car and I get to my desk, and I can still continue listening to that show on my laptop, or then I'm then picking up my phone and I'm going for a run and I'm still listening to that show on my phone, and I'm not having to switch. I'm not having to re-download the file every time, things like that. So the technology itself is helping with the consumption massively as well.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, one of my favorite podcasts, they generally go on for 45 minutes to just over an hour. And so a lot of the time, I don't have something that occupies me long enough to listen to a full episode.
Yeah, exactly.
So I will, when there is a kind of an obvious break in it, I will hit pause and then just pick it up later. And if I open up Spotify on my iPad or on my laptop instead, the first thing it shows me is the last thing I was listening to, which is the podcast, and says, basically, do you want to continue it? And given the number of times I open those apps, it's just for brand exposure there as well. It's fantastic because the first thing you see is that the cover for that podcast.
Totally.
So when you're speaking to brands, do you find that there are any kind of myths or misconceptions about using podcasts or just audio content for marketers?
Yeah, I'd say the biggest misconception is that you produce a podcast, you throw it online, and it'll go viral, and you don't have to do anything other than just produce it, put it online. The reality is that right now there's over 1 million podcasts, individual podcasts, not just episodes. And that's a lot. I would argue that a lot of them are, not as at the level of quality that they should be around for, a whole lot longer. But the reality is that you've got some competition out there when it comes to content. And so we encourage our clients, and luckily we offer these services to act like a broadcaster. And so when you produce a piece of content as a broadcaster, you have to market it. So we have a full marketing program that we implement for our clients to get as many listeners to that show as possible. And that that has a whole range of sort of tactics involved, but it's everything from I'll use merchandising as an example. The big misconception when you have your podcast on, Apple Podcasts, for example, everyone's sort of dream is to get into the new and notable section of Apple Podcasts, because that's, it has the highest visibility. It's fantastic real estate. But a lot of people, a lot of marketers think that you have to beat some sort of algorithm in order to to get up there. The reality is that Apple has a whole handful of editors whose job it is to pick and choose podcasts to feature. So it's a human on the other end of that decision, and there's a bunch of them. And so we pitch those humans on why our shows should be featured, and they do get featured. And so it's stuff like that where you have to go to market, and you have to put together a strategy and plan for getting the show as much exposure as possible. So we're creating PR lists and reaching out to both traditional and new media, niche media, depending on what it is that we're producing. There's even podcast media and culture media, and literally reaching out to them and pitching them on why they should write stories on our shows. We're also looking for cross-promotional opportunities. Other podcast listeners are the low-hanging fruit of podcast marketing. So, what other shows should our host, for example, be pitched to be a guest on in exchange for maybe their show's host to come on ours? Or we're doing a content swap where another podcast drops one of our episodes into their feed as bonus content in exchange for us doing the same. The podcast world is growing like crazy, and it's super exciting, but we're still at that stage where there's not a lot of rules. And so it really comes down to imagination, creativity, and what you can do to get as many listeners as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in that regard, it's just like any content marketing channel, really.
Totally.
None of them really work if you just post it and that's it.
Exactly.
But
I would say that a lot of marketers still believe that that's not the case.
I guess it depends on the channel. I think people know if you write a blog article and post it on your website, you have to go and distribute it and promote it. Right. But I guess maybe because the podcast is hosted on other platforms, they assume that those platforms kind of market it for them. And I
think also because there's this ingrained sort of, word of mouth aspect to podcasting, which is absolutely there. But I think marketers look at that and think that that's how the show is going to, gain steam. Because maybe that's how they found out about podcasting, or a podcast is a friend introduced it to them, and that's definitely true. And we have all sorts of ways of trying to increase that word of mouth, but you do actually have to put together a concerted effort to get the show in as many ears as possible, and that even involves sometimes some paid promotion. And there's a whole range of different, options for doing that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that all the podcasts I've listened to or still listen to have come through someone recommending them.
Totally.
I was never really a podcast listener until I checked out these like couple of different podcasts and just absolutely loved them. And they are the ones that I tend to just stick with. I've probably got a list of 10, 15 in Spotify that I kind of favorited, but yeah, it's just the one or two that I really listen to, and that is partly down to just the time that I consume podcasts.
Right.
It tends to be when I'm out of the flat, and right now, that's not much of the time.
Yeah, yeah.
Especially, I mean, I noticed even with the ones that the one for now that I really really like. Called Off Menu. It's a fantastic, really funny podcast about food. And nice. When I left my last job to focus on consulting full time, I stopped listening to it, and it's because I didn't really get out of the house because I didn't have that commute anymore.
Right.
And so I started to just go for a walk at lunchtime or something.
Yeah. Stick
the podcast on and just make time for it.
Yeah, and not everyone's, I can listen to a podcast while I work. My wife can't. She can't have any noise, no distraction whatsoever. But she still needs a break. And so to your point, she'll leave the house and go for a walk and listen to a podcast, or she'll even just take some time and sit on the couch and listen to a podcast, just as her way of kind of escaping for 20 minutes, half an hour.
Yeah. I'm a background noise person. Tends to be actually, weirdly, Spotify on my iPad off to the side of my desk on a very low volume.
Oh, interesting.
And it can be pretty much any music. I'm actually quite a big fan of like rock and heavy metal. Yeah. And I can even have that on just on the side, as long as there's noise.
Funny.
That works for me. And then occasionally I need to put headphones on. And if I put headphones on, that's when I can really focus.
I mean, if I had my way, I would always have, the radio on at least, or listening to NPR or CBC, somebody talking just in the background at all times, or of course a podcast. My wife would never let that happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's why you get websites that are dedicated to noise now.
Oh, totally.
There's so many that will just give you coffee shop noise.
I was going to say there's a coffee shop one. Yeah.
I came across one that gave you could change like 5 or 6 different types of sounds. So you could have, voices in the background. You could have a bit of rain. One was like some digital noise. I can't remember what that one was about, but
interesting.
Yeah. And you could create your own little soundtrack for your background noise.
I wonder with, when and hopefully when the pandemic starts to sort of wind down, who knows what year, but, with everybody working from home right now, I wonder if there's going to be like some of those sounds, but they're like, crying child in the background, or the buzz of your fridge, or, leaky toilet.
a random coworker question every now and again.
Oh God. Yeah. The ping of your chat windows.
Yeah. Cool. So, if a brand wanted to get started with a podcast, what are some of the things they need to consider? I don't mean quite like technical setup or anything like that, but I guess the types of content and why they should be doing it.
Totally. So, there's kind of three questions that we always ask clients to consider before we really dig deep into this. And the first is, how can your brand deliver value to the listener? So again, it's all about the listener. So digging deep and understanding, what do they need? What do they care about? What do they listen to? So, let's take, for example, right now, there's unfortunately way too many people that are looking for work. A lot of those people have perhaps not been in the job market for decades in some cases, and that they're in that sort of higher level management position that is, become redundant, unfortunately. So let's say that you're a brand like Indeed, which is a great online job search engine. Yep. You're going to create a podcast. Let's pretend like your audience is in their, maybe their 50s. They've, again, been in management, looking for work for the first time. So what do they need? Well, they're probably going to need, to, in some cases be reskilled. Maybe they're worried about their competitiveness back in the market. Maybe they're looking to make a shift. What do they care about? They obviously care about finding a job, but also feeling confident that their skills are marketable and that there's some hope for them in the job market. What do they listen to? Maybe they're listening to Joe Rogan you talked about, or maybe it's like a Tim Ferriss podcast, or maybe they're listening to something a little more sciencey, like a Radio Lab. And then create value, create value in return. So maybe if you're Indeed and you're looking to create a podcast for this market, you're creating a show that's all about inspiring people who have made changes in their careers at a later stage in life. Maybe it's a show that teaches people all about the sort of the journeys that some of these other people that are just like them have taken and are and give this audience some confidence, and maybe talk about some of the other stories of people who have tried new skills or picked up new skills along the way to make themselves more. I mean, anyway, this is just off the top of my head, but like, something that is just high value in return. So as a brand, ask yourself, what can you teach? How can you help? How can you entertain? And the biggest question that we always like to ask our clients is, what does the world need most that you are most qualified to talk about? And then create a show around that. Yeah,
I guess like you pointed out earlier, towards the start, it's not about your brand and your products, but obviously you'd want to tap into the area of expertise that your brand represents.
Exactly.
So
now that all this being said, you also, you want to make sure that you're the right type of brand. I definitely think that a podcast isn't for all brands. You have to be focused on the audience at all times. You have to be focused on delivering a ton of value at all times. More than that, though, as a brand, you have to have a level of creative bravery in this production, because if you don't, you're gonna create a podcast that's either too boring, talking too much about yourself, or is just not anything that is of interest to your listeners. And so you have to be continually dialing up that level of creative bravery to just keep pushing yourself to produce great content.
Yeah, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine maybe for fashion it wouldn't work so well, because it's such a visual industry. Even if you weren't really trying to sell your products on it, the stuff that you're talking about is still quite, people want to see.
I disagree. I'd say that fashion is all about storytelling, though. And yes, there is a visual aspect to what they do. But there's great storytelling around the creation of the clothes, or the ideation behind some of these ideas that designers have, or if you're a brand like, let's say Ralph Lauren, there's sort of a lore and history behind the brand. And so maybe it's an opportunity to, do some great interviews with, iconoclastic, people who, have that same level of, have those same, similar brand characteristics. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the product. It doesn't necessarily have to be about the specific thing you do. I would argue that, the more you do that, the more you get into advertising land, and instead, what are great stories to be told? What are great people to feature? What are great things to teach? And it just happens to be brought to you by the brand.
Yeah. So just throwing an idea at you. So there's a brand here called, let's go with Packed Coffee, which is like a subscription coffee service.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
They send you like a small bag every week, 2 weeks, whatever you choose. But they made a big thing about how I think they have a guide dedicated to just kind of traveling the world, meeting these farmers, like kind of almost like sampling their product.
Mm-hmm.
And then deciding whether they're going to buy basically from that farmer and make sure he's sorted and doesn't have to go through, some of the massive brands that, I don't know, maybe don't pay as much or as well. And they focus on quality. So, they could probably do a podcast which is quite heavily around their product, kind of telling the story of a new farmer each week or month or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, you nailed it. Totally.
Yeah, so their one would be like, it's obviously really about their product, because they're basically selling one of their products each podcast episode, but in a way which is really storytelling and really aligns with their values as well.
Absolutely. Yep. You absolutely nailed it.
Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. Plus, it's coffee, so you'd listen to it. They'd say listen to it while you drink. They actually did a magazine for a while, and the idea of that was you could kind of read through this magazine, and it told the story of a farmer each week, and it covered a few other things like what some of their staff were up to. And yeah, the idea behind that was you could read through this while having a cup of the coffee that they've sent you.
Oh, totally. I got all sorts of ideas. I mean, they should have, QR codes on the bags that get delivered to, to people as part of the subscription. And when you scan it, it goes to the podcast, and you listen to an episode on the coffee you're drinking, and how it was sourced and who produced it. And you hear the story of the family, and and then, this is something that we try to encourage with all of our shows is, how can we up the level of what we call texture in the episode, so that it's not just a talking head or just a straight interview. So I could hear the wind rustling through the fields as beans are being picked, or the sound of tractors plowing the fields, and the sound of the steam coming off the roaster, the industrial roaster, and maybe there's a tour of the plant and talking about the ethical nature of how beans are sourced, and so these are all great ways of enriching these stories, and really giving as much of a fuller experience to the listener.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we just created a podcast.
Yeah, I think that's a really great idea. There's another brand I'm thinking of as well called Naked Wines, which we definitely have here. I'm not sure if it's...
Yeah, I think we have them here.
Yeah, they might have moved over. And they source loads of their wine. Well, so they merged with Majestic Wine, which was, I guess, just a wine retailer, like a big, almost like a warehouse sort of wine retailer, I think. But Naked Wine's thing was they went out, found the vineyards, found the suppliers, and I think they basically buy their whole stock. If they like what they're doing, right, they just buy it all, and they take out the middleman. Like there's no, the producer doesn't have to do any marketing, doesn't have to really do any selling or anything like that. It's just working directly with Naked Wines, and Naked Wines sells it straight on to people like me. And they have their angel program, which is kind of, you pay a monthly fee, but which is credit. And then that money, every now and again, they'll kind of email out and say, what do you angels want us to do with your money? Do you want us to invest in like a new Prosecco or boxed wine? Boxed wine seems to be a thing they're going for at the moment.
Yeah.
And there's just really good stories behind it all. And there's a whole community on their website. And I'm sure they could do an amazing podcast just doing a story about each of their suppliers each time.
No, it sounds great. Now we created two podcasts.
Yeah.
You should be my UK representative.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll talk afterwards. I mean, you probably kind of mentioned it anyway, really. But what are the kind of big or common mistakes you see when people are either doing their podcasts, or if they kind of come to you and say, "We've got this podcast idea. Here's what we want to do." What are the mistakes you see?
Yeah, I'd say there's kind of three, and they're not so much mistakes. It's just and they're not red flags, but it's just something to be mindful of. I think the first one is, does everybody really want to listen to your CEO talk for every episode about the company and about his leadership style and all that sort of stuff? Not to say that that's wrong 100% of the time, and trust me, I would want to listen to a podcast, that is all about Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whatnot. But considering, the industry you're in or the size of the company, like, is that always the best use of the opportunity that you have? The second one is the feeling that comes from client. Maybe feeling's not the right word, but a lot of clients think that somebody from within the company is the best person to host the show. And again, that's not wrong. And we have worked with, internal hosts and our podcast for Expedia, for example, Out Travel the System, is hosted by Nisreen Tazi. She's the global head of communications for Expedia. She's a fantastic talker. She knows how to do an interview. She's perfect for the job. not all of these people are right for being a host. One, it's incredibly difficult, as you know yourself, to conduct an interview. It's even more so when there's multiple people on, in the interview, and it's a bit of a roundtable discussion. Not everybody is as comfortable in front of a microphone as they might be, in a room at a boardroom table having an internal discussion. The bigger reason, though, is because the podcast is coming from a brand. We know that customers already have a little bit of skepticism going into it, and it's our job to overcome that by producing great content that's high value. If you have an internal host, there can sometimes be a little bit of a conflict of interest there. So, we try to eliminate that subjectivity as much as possible. So we would recommend hiring an outside host. There's all sorts of ways of doing so, whether it's going through a talent agent or whether it's just, hitting the pavement and creating a list of who you think would be right and then reaching out to them and crafting a deal. It's not as expensive as most people think. And then it gives them, it gives you the opportunity to hire, a professional host who is going to feel comfortable, is going to be great on a microphone. Also will come with, most of them will come with a social following, which helps, with the marketing of the show. So it's just something to consider. And then the third area is, this tendency to try to get absolutely everything right, in the production and in an episode. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times, comms teams will get involved and everybody tries to scrutinize every single word and every single phrase and everything has to be perfect. And the reality is that it doesn't have to be perfect. Podcast audiences are quite forgiving, and there is this sort of organic nature to podcasting. And so it's okay if, a line is flubbed and someone forgot what they were trying to say. So we try to maintain that, authenticity as much as possible. But I think a lot of clients get into this thinking that you're producing a J.J. Abrams film. And the reality is that it's professional and it's well crafted and it's going to do its job, but we also need to still maintain, a level of authenticity in the production.
Yeah, exactly. I think on the second point, I guess part of that probably starts with it's just almost like the natural assumption is that the host would be someone in the company. Just like every other activity that the company does in marketing or whatever.
Totally.
It just, right, we should do a podcast. Who's the best person in the company to do it? It's just like the natural question to ask.
Exactly.
And then, completely get it on the third point. I can completely see like brand teams or whoever just being all over it, being like, is that sentence on brand? Is that question on brand? All that sort of stuff.
Totally.
Which to them is literally a case of changing it from one word to another, and to everyone else it's something you barely notice.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to discount their roles, and I absolutely think that it's their job to to have a level of brand safety in everything that they do. But as a podcast listener is a lot more forgiving of these things than in other types of mediums for sure. And so, and I think if you become too scripted and too formulaic, it loses that charm.
Yeah, absolutely. If people think every episode is exactly the same, but with maybe a slightly different theme, it kind of loses.
Right.
Just loses that appeal, doesn't it? You get a bit bored because you know what to expect.
Exactly.
Do you think there are any? Obviously there will be, but what are the big trends that are going to come up with podcasts and audio over, I don't know, the next 12, 18 months? Do you see any big developments coming?
Well, I think you're starting to see, the consolidation of podcasts, creation and distribution. We're going to see rise in the war between Apple and Spotify. I think Amazon's going to start to make, to make a play, or more of a play, into it as well. You're seeing this capturing of talent, with Spotify and Joe Rogan, and Spotify and Michelle Obama, and I heard that they even have Hillary Clinton. So you'll start to see this sort of exclusivity, unfortunately, as a result. You'll only be able to listen to Joe Rogan on Spotify, things like that, which we in the podcast world understand, and we always knew that it was going to be that way, but it also sort of it limits your audience size, because it's then just dependent on who's who has that Spotify subscription. But it's totally inevitable. We're seeing a lot more news broadcasts, or more news publications creating podcast content. So marketers are seeing it as part of the overall mix when we're working with the likes of New York Times or Vox.
I was going to say, so with that, do you think it's kind of like maybe news channels moving away from TV, where maybe viewers are on the decline, and moving to something like a podcast, which can basically give the same content, but in a format that a lot of people are happy to consume, because they don't have to be sat in front of the TV?
Exactly. And also it's a lot easier to produce and cheaper to produce. We're noticing that, let's take the New York Times, for example. They purchased a company called Autumn. I always get it mixed up. AUDM. And what they were specializing in was essentially audio blogging. So but in the form of these articles. So you could get an Autumn subscription and listen to the long form writing in the Atlantic or the New Yorker and things like that. And so what the New York Times is starting to do is every article has an audio component where you can listen to the entire article instead of reading it, because I think there is something to be said for the time shifting that needs to happen. And if you're an executive, are you going to take 20 to 30 minutes to read a really long New York Times article, or would you rather listen to it driving to the office or running on the treadmill in the morning? And so I think these news organizations are seeing podcasts as a way of reaching a new audience. Let's be honest, younger audience hasn't necessarily gravitated towards some of these larger news groups. So there's a great way to reach that audience, which they've to date been struggling to do.
Yeah, the just going back to the exclusivity, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, obviously, it's only the massive people, and if you don't really have an interest, it doesn't make too much difference. Joe Rogan's a big one because obviously his YouTube channel, he gets to put like a summary sort of video up, doesn't he? Like highlights,
which is essentially just an ad for the larger show.
Yeah, exactly. But his YouTube channel is massive, so giving up that is a big thing, and it's where it has annoyed a lot of people. But at the same time, he's been doing this for years. He's been putting in hours and hours, like to every episode. You can kind of forgive him when it's paid out like that. Yeah, he cashed out. It's those years of work. He's still doing it, so it's not like he's just sold up and moved on. But he got the payout that he's deserved for the work over the years.
Exactly, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people though think that he could have asked for more.
I suppose it's first deal, wasn't it? It's the first podcast
that we know of.
deal.
Yeah, totally. You mean first deal? Yeah, this is jump around. But he could be. I see him similar to the sort of Howard Stern. He's at that level, and will to your point, will at one point perhaps jump somewhere else.
Possibly, yeah. we'll see, won't we? It could be YouTube. Potentially YouTube could say, well, we'll give you X million to come back because it did so well. And
or Google buys Spotify and he comes back by default.
Yeah. That just to stick it to Apple.
Yeah. Well, these are scenarios that are not out of the question by any means.
No, absolutely not. Cool. So I guess just moving on to some more like general questions for you, really. Do you have any pet peeves when it comes to marketing? Just generally marketing.
Pet peeves. So I was lucky enough to work for some fantastic agencies. DDB being one of them, which at the time was one of the top agencies in the world. I then moved on to Cossette, which is the top which was the top agency in Canada at the time. So I've always been lucky enough to work for incredibly talented creatives, and the one thing that they always drilled into me that I'm a big believer in is people don't hate marketing. People hate shitty marketing.
Yeah, absolutely.
People hate bad ads. And so I think, and I think one of the biggest mistakes that marketers make is they forget, the audience, and they forget who they're talking to and work backwards from there. And there's way too much sort of barfing out of the brand first and not the person first. And so I'm a big believer that a great creative advertisement is something that people do in fact enjoy and engage with, and then hopefully it does its job.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ads wouldn't go viral. The good ads wouldn't go viral if they were if people hated advertising or marketing.
Exactly. Yeah. Totally.
And
there's some really, really bad bad marketing out there.
Well, I'd say the majority of it is.
Yeah.
It
gives it all a bad name. With
like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of companies advertising all the time across all the channels, there's bound to be kind of rubbish out there, and a lot of it I think comes down to people creating the advertising for what they think people want to see, and coming up with their own creative ideas and saying, oh, that'd be a good way to advertise the brand.
Totally.
But not really doing much research into what their audience wants, what their audience responds to, like previously or with other brands. And just making it a bit more too much about themselves, really.
Exactly.
Yeah. And just finally, do you think there's any particular really underrated aspect of marketing at the moment?
Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, podcasts.
Yeah, obviously got to say that one.
I mean, nothing that comes to mind. I think we're so caught up in the the algorithms and whatnot that I think people are forgetting the human side of it. So I think some of the underrating aspects of marketing are some of the more simple mechanisms like word of mouth and referrals and whatnot. I think we have become a bit lazy when it comes to marketing and expecting the machines to do the majority of the work for us. But nothing can replace a great referral. Great customer service will get you that great referral, and having a strong referral plan in place, or just implementing different ways of wowing your audience or customers so that they have no choice but to talk about you. I think those are the sort of the human side of it that we can't forget, because the digital side of it is not going to go away anytime soon, by any means. But that's why we get so excited about podcasting, is that it's still basic storytelling, which has been around for since literally the caveman. And obviously radio, it comes from radio, and that's obviously had its days. And so we just break things down into the simple human side of it as much as possible.
Yeah, I think I've got to agree. It's there's a very, very heavy data focus these days, and a focus on kind of like setting up automation and letting AI or just letting tools run your marketing, so that you can move on to the next tool, which then gets set up with automated marketing, and just forgetting about and just using data too much, almost. Looking at the numbers and trying to make changes just on those numbers, rather than thinking, well, why are people reacting differently?
Yeah.
How do we make this ad more appealing to them, rather than just changing the phrasing to see if that will have an impact?
Yeah, there's a fantastic thought leader named David Hyatt, who is an incredible marketer. He would probably hate being called a marketer, but he's are you familiar with the Do lectures?
I'm not sure I am, actually.
Yeah, Do lectures are I definitely suggest checking them out. It's essentially like the TED Talk model, only a lot more stripped down and a lot more sort of human. The Do lectures are conducted, in a cowshed in Wales, and then sort of broadcast through YouTube and stuff like that. But he talks a lot about how brands are built with humans in mind, and there's human beings that are at the end of those at the end of those brands, and you can't forget that everything that we do as a company comes from humans. He's very, very much in touch with his staff. He started a denim company called Hyatt Denim.
I know who that is.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
As soon as you mentioned that brand, I've seen it.
It's a beautiful brand, and he's just an amazing person to listen to, and they've produced all sorts of books about culture and teamwork, but also like meditation and email marketing. Like it's like a really cool eclectic company, but every time I engage with that brand, it kicks me back into remembering that, what we do is such a, has such a human element to it. And to your point, it's easy to get caught up in the algorithms and data quite easily.
Yeah, completely agree. It sounds, I'll have to go check those out. And I'll might add a link on the podcast episode. This has been amazing stuff, really, really interesting, and actually quite exciting. It makes me want to go kind of work out another podcast to start. So totally. find a topic that I'd just love to sit and chat about, other than marketing, obviously. If people want to reach out to you or find out more, what's the best way of doing that?
Yeah, so the best way is to check us out at jaraudio.com. We also have a bi-weekly webinar that we run that I'd love anybody who's listening to join. You need to go to jaraudio.com/webinar. So this is a 60-minute webinar that is all about the 10 reasons why brands are embracing podcasts. So we break down what those 10 reasons are. We talk about how brands can get involved in podcasts. What are some of the do's and don'ts? And it's a really, really high value, engaging opportunity for, marketers, brand managers, CEOs, comms directors, to really get agency folk as well, to get a really good overview on the podcasting world and what the opportunity is for brands. Other than that, check me out on LinkedIn. Don't check me out on Twitter, because these days I seem to just be getting in political arguments about the U.S. election and stuff like that. So if you're going to do that, give it a couple weeks. And we're also on Twitter as a brand, jar_audio. Check out the website. Register for our newsletter as well. We do a bi-weekly newsletter called the Tip Jar. It's all about tips and tricks for the podcast world.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll have to check that out myself as well. I'll get some of that stuff up on the Customers Who Click website as well.
Don't do my Twitter. It's bad.
Yeah, all right. I'll make sure I leave that one out. All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Roger.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
So as you heard, there are some fantastic opportunities out there for brands with podcasts. And the best thing is they're actually really easy and cheap to produce. You just need a microphone, hosting, and some editing software, and away you go. Of course, you can spend a bit more money to improve the quality of the microphone. You can promote the podcast. You can hire a studio and record it in person as well, record video. But one of the key things to think about is what you want to achieve with the podcast and how you're going to measure that. Podcasts aren't really for selling, and it'd be really difficult to create an ongoing podcast that focuses on selling and does it really well. There are some great YouTube channels out there which are all about the product. Will It Blend, for example? But the same doesn't really apply to a podcast unless you're really clever about it. A bit like the coffee example I mentioned. If you tell the stories behind your products and get people really interested in your brand values through that works really well. But if you literally just describe the coffee and like how it tastes and stuff, it's probably not going to go down very well. Give it a go. Even if you just record a few test episodes internally that never go public, it just you and your team, you can work out your approach. And once you're actually happy with it, and once you think you've got the layout and the structure of it, get it out to your audience. If you'd like to learn more about podcasting, reach out to Roger on LinkedIn or head over to jaraudio.com. Any other podcast questions, feedback, guest requests, anything like that, please send them over to will@customerswhoclick.com. Next up, I've got Zach Schiffman on to talk about how brands can use photo booths and personal experiences to build engagement with your customers. But until then, keep those customers clicking.